Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. My name's Andrew Jack from the Financial Times. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion over the next hour on measuring societal impact in business research and how we can move from challenges to change. We've got a great panel of 4 people here to discuss this issue, and very keen to hear also from you on your thoughts, reflections, recommendations, resources, and questions directly to the panel. So briefly, and they'll introduce themselves in a minute, but we have Usha Haley from the Wichita State University. We have, Renate Meyer, Maura Scott, and Mike Taylor. Just a word about the FT. And our involvement and interest in this space. So we, amongst other things, produce and have done for more than 2 decades, rankings of business schools alongside more qualitative coverage of the many activities they're doing. And of course, like other sectors of academia, there's been growing discussion about the importance increasingly of them focusing on environmental issues, on the Sustainable Development Goals, on other issues around the wider value to society of their teaching and research. And of course, one of the challenges about that is it's much more difficult to understand, to measure and incorporate, therefore, those sorts of more subtle issues than it is some of the harder, as it were, metrics around financial outcomes or career destinations, and some of the other factors that are incorporated into our and other rankings. And so very interested to try to engage with the academic community, with authors, with publishers and others to understand more about this huge, of course, and incredibly important field of bibliometrics. We were well aware and have had many discussions about the limitations of all forms of rankings, including citations and impact factors in journals, about the weightings in different fields and between different institutions, about even that's in the kind of core academic space, let alone before we start looking at the wider resonance and impact of research into practice. But I think it's a really important, essential area to focus on. And so very grateful to Sage and to our participants, amongst others here, to try and engage in this discussion. I will just put a couple of resources up, and as I say, I'd encourage you all who are watching to equally post any reflections or resources. I wrote a short piece here, which is actually in a Sage journal, about our current rankings, but also the both potential ways forward and some of the challenges and limitations and needs to try to incorporate more of these issues. And one concrete step we're also trying to take in this direction, working with RRBM, which is a network of business academics working around responsible research, is a so-called hackathon, which is designed to try to move from the critiques and the limitations towards something a bit more operational. Let's see what could be done, trying to capture existing and new data sets to really understand more about the value of translation into practice. We're also alongside doing some more qualitative work, including a series of showcases and awards. We're going to announce the opening of a new such award actually on Monday, which we'll circulate the details to you of, which is precisely, amongst other things, trying to look at academic research with impact on policy and practice, to try to sort of tease backwards from judgments and assessments of impact to see again what indicators that might point to as ways to try to quantify some of these areas of research. So that's enough for me. It's now a great pleasure to hand over to our panelists. We'll have 2 or 3 initial rounds of discussion and then throw it open to you. But do please throughout, as I've said, use the Q&A function here on Zoom to post any questions and reflections. And I should say that this session is being recorded and it will be possible to view it afterwards on YouTube and elsewhere. So don't worry if you miss anything initially. So in strict surname alphabetical order, I'm going to first of all just have a round of ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their areas of focus around this, and perhaps any particular projects they're working on that might be relevant to our discussion. So let me turn first, Usha, please.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Sage, for inviting me as well. This clearly is a very important topic. I've been working on it for about 7 years at this point, culminating in my latest book, Impact and the Management Researcher. It's a British Academy of Management Routledge publication. And I'm also one of the editors for the Academy of Management Learning and Education special issue on scholarly impact. Yes, we are discussing this more and more. I am unsure, though, whether we're actually having any external impact at all. As a matter of fact, all the data that I have gathered seems to show that we're having less and less impact than we had, say, 2 decades ago. And it'd be very interesting to see the other, or to hear the other panelists' opinions on this, and is also about the FT rankings, which are clearly very influential. Thank you.
Thank you. A great provocative question, which we'll certainly come back to shortly, Usha. But Renate, please, over to you.
Hello, I'm Renate Meyer. I'm also very pleased to be here, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm a professor for organization studies at WU Vienna and also a professor at Copenhagen Business School. I run a research institute for urban management and governance at WU as well. I'm the past division chair of OMT. That's the third largest division of the Academy of Management, and I'm the co-editor-in-chief of Organization Studies, and that is one of the famous FT50 journals. It is a journal that for over 40 years had the mandate of looking at organizations and organizing in society. So the concern with societal impact is actually not new to us. So it has been more or less the DNA of this journal for 40 years. I currently serve on 2 supervisory boards, the Austrian Science Foundation and the Vienna Hospital Association. That is the organization that is running all public hospitals in Vienna. And they are quite busy at the moment, as you can imagine. My own research interests include collective action in crisis, or the institutionalization and translation of new management idea. And the current research project that is relevant in this context here is together with my colleagues from CBS, and we challenge our overwhelmingly positive view of impact and investigate unintended and undesirable consequences of the change initiatives in academia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Renate. Maura Scott.
Hi there, I'm Maura Scott. I'm a professor of marketing at Florida State University. In addition to that, I'm the president-elect of the Academic Council for the American Marketing Association. One thing that's very interesting, I think, about the AMA when you think about impact is that we have about 22,000 members, and only about 15% of that membership is academics. We have about 40% college students, and we have about another 55% that are managers and practitioners. And of course, everybody who's doing the math in their head is saying, that's more than 100%. But it's because some members play more than one role. So someone might, for example, be a student and also business owner. Or something like that. But as you can see, the vast proportion of the members are managers, and I think that this is something very special about our group in terms of being able to get impact out to managers in terms of our research findings, and also to connect with students before they're going out into the work world and helping to make those connections with them. In addition to that, I'm also the joint editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. This is one of 4 of the American Marketing Association journals, and JPPNM has been around about 40 years. We're in the process of celebrating the 40th anniversary right now. And one of the things that I feel is exciting about the journal is that we have a very active engagement with the policy community. And so we have policy makers in terms of agency members like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as members of our editorial review board, who are providing input and helping to guide papers through the review process. And I think that's something very special about the journal in terms of the quality of the insights, in terms of having breadth of perspectives, helping with the projects. In terms of my own research, I'm a consumer behavior researcher, and I'm primarily focused on understanding how to use consumer psychology and marketing insights to heighten individual and societal well-being. And so that's kind of been my mantra my whole career, and it's just been a wonderful ride.
Thanks very much, Maura. And now, Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Taylor. I work digital science. Principally, I work at Altmetric. Altmetric is a company that takes research findings, research objects such as books, chapters, articles, proceedings, preprints, and so on, and we look for evidence of where they're being used across the broader internet. So typically we look, for example, for news, Twitter, blogs, Wikipedia, policy documents, patents, and many other kinds of areas. Unlike my esteemed colleagues on this webinar, I'm not a specialist in business schools. What I am is a specialist in impact and tracking impact across the internet. As part of my day job, I frequently find myself writing reports for academics. And latterly, over the last year, there has been an increased amount of interest from the corporate sector, who are interested in understanding the impact of the research that they're working on, the research that they fund, the research that they support. So again, I think this will give me a good opportunity to talk about some of the anonymized findings that we've been surfacing from our reports over the last year. Thanks very much, everyone. Good to be
Thanks,
here.
Mike. And we'll let it come back to this. I mean, what is quite interesting, of course, is there's a kind of extreme with, let's say, some of the health and science journals on one end, where there's a very clear sort of audit trail and focus on impact, of course, to perhaps a much more fuzzy space with all sorts of different priorities and challenges in some of the humanities and social sciences, and including business school areas. So it'll be very interesting to perhaps draw some contrasts with that. But let's begin then. Sort of our first item, as it were, is thinking about this question of the growing demand in business and management specialisms to understand societal impact. And it would be great to hear from our panelists about, why this is an emerging issue and how the debate's been evolving. Let's start with you, Usha, and I guess it does seg back to your very tempting, provocative comment at the start, that you're kind of unsure about the extent of impact and you think it may have even declined over the past 2 decades. Tell us more about that.
I feel comfortable looking at data, and I know I looked at data, and we certainly are talking more about impact in the journals. So we're rewarded for talking about impact in the major journals. But our actual impact, I mean, if you look at it for the last 5 years, the word impact and our use of it has increased gently and then exponentially. It sort of tripled last year and this year. So we really are talking more about it. The problem is, if I look at what actual external impact we have had as academics in management, which is my field, international business, we've actually had less and less impact. So my data show that we are covered less in the media, our journals, than we were 20 years ago. If you do a normalized Google search because there are many, many more journals now and many, many more pages to publish in. If you do a normalized Google search, we are 10% of what we were. And you can look at a Google search as being an expression of constituents' interest. We're 10% of where we were 2 decades ago. So people are actually looking for us less, our external constituents. And I'm interested in business government relations. That's my that's my thing. I work with governments. I have found that if you look at our management journals, and I don't know about the UK because I think that's a different database altogether, but in the US at least, we are cited, I mean, in the or for all time, maybe in 3 or 4 federal regulations at all time. That doesn't, for me, our journals, for example, that doesn't show to me great impact. But we are gaining in citations, especially if you look at Claravit and Google Scholar, which means as our field grows larger, we cite ourselves more. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. We're having impact within our profession. But external impact, I don't think it's really debatable. And when we did this survey for the Academy of Management, as far as I know, the only survey done of its members by a major academic association, about over 60% of our members, 20,000 worldwide, thought that we did not really have external impact. Sorry, did I go over my time there?
No, wonderful thoughts, and I'd love to come back to those with the others. But let's just do a quick round. Renata, what's your take on sort of if and why, and in what forms we are seeing greater focus around societal impact of business and management research?
Well, maybe I start with the good news after Usha. That may kind of be necessary. So I think that we are now broadly aware that the wicked problems of the world have an organizational and management component, and that they cannot be addressed without us and without the collaborative effort across the sectors, including business. So business and management scholars, that would be my claim here, we do have a lot of relevant knowledge in this regard, but we are not listened to the same extent as other experts. And that's exactly what Usha was saying before. So we need to change this. And I think that there is a broad awareness about this. Second, I think why are we more aware of this now is I think that, and we can, it's a completely different discussion of why this is the case, but maybe part of the internationalization and the need to publish in all the high-ranking journals has contributed to a certain detachment of our kind of publications with the field that the empirical fields that we study. And I think that it has become clear that changes in the incentive structure in the higher education field are required and necessary to kind of put that back into a healthy relationship. So I think that there is actually a lot happening with regard to the topics of our study, and think of all the thematic calls in the big grant schemes, the awards that Andrew was talking about, our RMB initiatives, high bar initiatives, and many more. So there's a lot going on. Also with regard to knowledge dissemination and translation of research to the non-academic audiences. I think that the professionalization of science communication, etc., that we are slowly picking up on this, but there's a long way to go. The criteria for career path, I think we need to work on that a lot more, and the new metrics, that's our topic here that we need. So yes, I think the conversation has changed and it is still changing. My concern is, however, that some of the new initiatives that will incentivize appearance, decoupling, and stardom rather than impact. So I think that some of the initiatives that we're having right now are actually backfiring and going into the wrong direction. So I think we will probably get more of the same rather than the change that we're looking for.
Okay, thanks very much. Maura.
Thank you, Andrew. Renata and Usha, thanks for your comments. My lens is a little bit different, and I think that makes for a great conversation. So with the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, because we have had this history of working, at least in North America so far, one of my goals as editor is that I've been actively working on is expanding this lens, but actually, the scholarly, rigorous research that has been done does impact and influence and inform policy. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. It was a JPPNM article that actually guides most of the regulation today, at least in the United States, around pyramid marketing. So that's clearly one of those topics that falls cleanly at the intersection of marketing and policy when you think about people being exploited through something like pyramid schemes. And The same could be said for some of the work that has come out of the journal on reference pricing and how subsequently legislation has regulated how firms can price products across different communities in an effort to be fair. But in terms of going forward and thinking about how do we measure impact in the community? One of the things that I love that Andrew brought up was this idea of RRBM. So I think across most of our disciplines, and certainly management was the community that initiated this idea of RRBM to a great degree. This is something that has been of great interest and focus for the American Marketing Association and for JPP&M. And over the last couple of years, the AMA has initiated an award to recognize research that is pushing the limits and making impact, doing that in a rigorous way, doing that in a way that's responsible and also respectful of subjects that are being engaged with this research. And I think that some of those types of initiatives are steps in the right direction. I think it's a journey, and we just kind of have to identify where we can be better. And just, it's kind of like, I used to work in product development at 3M. It's just continual improvement, basically. So do I think we're where we need to be today? No. Do I think we're getting there? Yes. Do I feel like we have a ways to go and a good plan to get there in terms of making a case for our relevance as business scholars? I agree with Renata when she says we have something to offer. We're approaching problem solving by tackling the problems that make a difference in the world in a very rigorous, systematic way, which is not always the way that business is tackling questions. They're on a different timeline. And so bringing those approaches together, plus the perspectives of policy experts, that to me has to be the direction and can be a good solution for the business community.
Thanks, Maura. And it's great to hear some good, tangible, practical examples of impact as well. A lot of the interest is, of course, in the detail, isn't it? Mike, over to you.
Yeah, I don't have a great deal to contribute. I was really struck by Professor Haley's comments about the volume of research, and I was just looking at some of our data around news mentions of research, and as Usha says, between 2015 and up to 2000, it was pretty static, and that's really interesting when we're thinking about mentions of research in the mainstream media. We don't generally see static as being a thing. One of the issues, of course, is that there is, for most of newspapers and CNN and so on, there's a fixed number of hours, there's a fixed amount of volumes of, there's a fixed number of journalists like Andrew who are using research and transmitting the results of research through to a wider audience. So we don't see, interestingly enough, we don't see that the explosion in volumes of research. But come COVID, it doubled. We're looking at my screen here. We're looking at about 1,200 mainstream media citations of business and management research every month, which is doubling over the previous period. Very interesting. Also, looking at the growth in Twitter and blogs, and there you don't see any kind of stasis at all. Those have been growing consistently over the last 10 years. So I think very much this is a question of having to chase the impact and understand where those conversations are happening, and particularly in areas of finance and corporate impact. We're not seeing it in the mainstream media, we're seeing it elsewhere. And this is partly why I'm working with corporates, because they're really interested to know where those loci of conversations are now taking place and how they can track them and how they can understand the consequences of funding research.
Thanks, Mike, and that actually makes a great seg to our second section here about, of the current metrics or the feasible ones that are around currently, what come closest to measuring societal impact? And maybe let's start with you, because you made those interesting points. And I do wonder, that there is perhaps, there are two issues here, aren't they? In general, I suppose the question is, how good are wider public, including media, references as an indicator of ultimate impact? And the second thing is thinking about the extremes, as I said earlier, between, as you say, COVID and, for example, health and scientific research, where there's a real culture of, and indeed a sort of regulatory obligation for, quite meticulous citing back to underlying research, and an appetite to spread the insights and the impact as widely as possible. Whereas, of course, in the business sphere, you might argue it's sort of completely against the interests of corporates to be gathering, sharing, or attributing other people's research when they want to sort of keep it for their own proprietary uses. So does that create some particular challenges? And are there some metrics that we could start to look at nonetheless in this field?
Yeah, it is somewhat self-selecting, of course, because the kinds of corporates that I'm working with are people who are interested in having that public profile. And certainly when you look at the databases, you can see that there are some organizations that like having a public profile, like engaging with research, like having that academia relationship with academia. And typically, of course, we are seeing that blurring of the edge. And I do wonder whether this phenomenon that Usha was discussing is somewhat representative of that breaking down of the boundaries between the academic ivory tower approach, if you like, and the more broader public. Certainly, and this is an N=1 thing, things are certainly changing. My son started university 2 years ago, and far from being told to not look at Wikipedia, his reading list to prepare for his first year study included Wikipedia links and included YouTube videos. And for me, this was one of those things where you go, wow, things really have changed when academics are saying, go away and use Wikipedia, go away and use YouTube. We also have to acknowledge that sometimes where impact is being found, we can't identify it. So one of the things that, for example, I would love to be able to report on is the extent to which business research is being cited in the ISO standards. That, for example, in terms of the standards, so for example, I have a friend who co-authored marketing data standards alongside a business school, but that data isn't public. So it's very, very hard for it to be reported on. To some extent, it's invisible. So we definitely have a bias towards data sources that are open rather than closed and proprietary. And that, of course, is a major issue when we're talking about reporting within particular disciplines that don't have that tradition of having open data available to work in.
Thanks. Usha, would you like to come back? You're on mute, Usha.
Obviously, I can't think and unmute at the same time. I don't want to be portrayed as a doomsday person. I like to think of myself as an optimist. I too think the business schools are really well placed to do something about impact. It is sobering, though, to look at what is actually happening and how much we talk about it. So we talk about it a lot. It's like the weather, but we're really doing very little about it. And so I do think it's interesting that people are talking about COVID and that it's getting cited in the mainstream media, which probably shows that we need to veer faster towards topics that others have an interest in and that are snowballing. I also think we need quality control. The Twitter universe is growing, as is the LinkedIn universe. Not for me, I have maybe 12 Twitter followers, but it's growing for everyone else. And yes, that is a method of communication, but I wouldn't really advocate Twitter or LinkedIn or Wikipedia as a source, an authoritative source to my students. It's fleeting. You never really know what the results are going to be, who's talking, what the authority behind that voice is. There's something to be said for peer evaluation and peer reviews. On the con side, in our journals, how do we expect people to contribute groundbreaking ideas when one of the main questions that editors ask is, what is your contribution to this body of theory and where do you fit in? I mean, that question by itself means we're encouraging incremental knowledge development. And so these are some of the tensions within our system that impede us from actually achieving impact.
Thanks. Renate, would you like to come in?
Yes, I would like to come in.
Practical measures.
Well,
what can we use?
Well, practical measures. I think that most of the metrics that we currently have, they target input, process, and output. But I have serious doubts that they actually measure outcome or impact, because clearly and obviously this is tricky. And you were referring to that in the beginning, Andrew, in your introductory statement. I think, so why is that so? Why is that tricky? I think that first of all, to measure outcome or impact has an attribution and a non-linearity problem. The causality is very difficult, if not impossible, to establish in this respect. So I think that we're talking actually about the impact of research, and we're not only talking about the impact of publications. And I think that these are quite two different things, because the impact of research actually also unfolds in the classroom. And this is a kind of impact that we have that is sort of not really well covered in this kind of citation game of articles or books, etc. Second, we have a temporality problem. Societal impact of research often happens a long time after the research itself and and also the publications. So there's a really long time gap in between. I think we have a level problem. It's the impact of research. Do we want to measure that on the level of individual publications? And in my view, this is mostly nonsense. Is it on the level of the individual researcher? Is it on the level of universities, of programs, of sort of what is the level on which we want to measure the impact? And second, and finally, I think we have a visibility or a vanity problem. Impact is a non-linear and a collective achievement. And the first results from our Copenhagen research project at CBS very clearly show that the researchers, they have to stay in the background if they want to have impact. And they cannot expect being named and cited and that their names are put forward. If they are named, then very often for legitimation purposes. Otherwise, they have to kind of just be content with having had influence and impact on the people and on the recipients. So this counting of how often somebody has been mentioned somewhere, I do not really think that actually measures impact. Every metric is a proxy, and there's a danger of goal displacement. That means that people try to achieve the metric, but not what this metric is trying to actually measure. And I think that there's a danger that we're going that way. The same with the citation counts that we had for the publication. And I think that something similar is happening with counting how often somebody is mentioned on social media or where not. So I think I'm quite skeptical of these kind of metrics, and I think we need a complete new measurement system and a new incentive structure for our work.
So nothing in terms of the current metrics, which, as you say, obviously can be reductive, that you offer hope.
Well, I cannot offer a complete system now, but I think the system has to work in a way that each and every individual metric has advantages and disadvantages. So the system of metrics has to try kind of to balance the things the disadvantages that the individual metrics will produce. And I do not really see that we actually have such a system in place, but we're trying. And I mean, we're trying hard, and this is good. Yeah, that's the way to go, but it is not in place yet. That would be my diagnosis.
Moira, what's your take? Tangible measures.
Yeah. This is something that I've spent a fair bit of time thinking about. And so one of the things that I've been doing recently with my joint editor is trying to figure out how we're doing this as researchers in our research community. One of the things that's actually just hot off the press, it's going to be in the January issue, is we conducted a survey among leading scholars who read the journal to ask them, when you look at the body of work, for example, for JPPM, but I don't think it needs to be just for this journal. I think actually it's a good question for all journals. How are we lining up against those UN Sustainable Development Goals that you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, Andrew? Where are we contributing to knowledge and helping to address those goals, and where could we be doing better? And based on that, looking to the future, what types of questions do we need to be tackling? And so that's sort of, to me, sort of one proxy of how do we continue to approach impact? And it was very telling because some of the areas where people were saying, like, you know what, the journal is doing a great job tackling these issues. They were also saying we need more research here. There were others on that list of goals where they say, gosh, this is a little bit more outside of the scope of what we can do as marketing scholars, business scholars, policy scholars, law scholars. And so I think that's a healthy exercise for various facets of our scholarly community to consider. The other thing is, I think I really loved what Renate said about sort of, as scholars, we shouldn't be the ones in the limelight. It really should be the scholarship. And so, one of the things that we have encouraged scholars in our community to do is kind of get out there and inform key decision makers about our findings, not trying to shape their decision making in any way, but to kind of say, like, look, here's a set of facts. Consider using those as you make policy decisions. And we've had people presenting to the US House of Representatives, to the Federal Trade Commission, not saying like, do this, don't do this, but saying, gosh, based on the research, here's what we know about consumer privacy and, the roles that organizations play in impacting individual well-being from a privacy standpoint, or here's what we know about, bias in financial institutions in terms of who's getting loans for their small businesses, even for COVID recovery loans, and who isn't getting those, and where is that bias taking place, and why is that taking place? And so I think, to me, a key, I guess, antecedent of impact is this dissemination and getting that information in the hands of people who are going to use it to make decisions. And so that's something that I've been very passionate about in some of my scholarly roles.
All right.
Please, go back.
First of all, I do know that a lot of scholars are really reticent and hesitant to go out and talk to the media or talk to policymakers. And that's a learned skill. And I think it's an important one. Just like me trying to learn the mute and unmute button, it can be learned. It may take a little while and a little bit of training, but it can happen. The second thing is, I have been involved in policy. My work has actually been made into federal regulation in the United States and in the EU and in Australia. I know of no policy-making situation where you're told, this is my research, use it for your decision. You're supposed to advocate a position, because they will have another researcher who will in some way testify against you. And you're supposed to say, these are my data, and from these data, I make this conclusion. I come to this conclusion. And so they know, just as we do, that research is not really objective, but based on some assumptions on which we build. And they can find other assumptions on which to build. And I think as an academic, we should understand that our research advocates a certain perspective, and because other people know it. That's what, but I'm also agree about the RBBM, and I think that's the right word, but right acronym, maybe I'm wrong. I think it's doing a great job.
Thanks, Mike. Let me just turn to you on this issue of kind of the best that we've got for now in terms of metrics.
Yeah, I have a couple of very brief comments. Renate is absolutely right about the pace of research and how quickly or how slowly that translates in business and management, we typically find that it takes 5 to 8 years for a piece of research to be appearing in news sources, in policy documents, and so on. I mean, to put it frankly, computer science is dead after 18 months, unless you're writing the Google algorithm. The difference is stark, and the evaluation systems that we use that are optimized to 3 years are frankly useless for all of those of us who work in the humanities and social sciences, and we need to completely rethink. Usha's point about expertise is absolutely bang on. We find when we look at the data, there is not a strong correlation between brilliance of academic achievement or volume of academic achievement and how well their researchers' voices are found. There are all sorts of relationships going on there. It does tend to have a strong bias towards people who are from particular areas and have particular voices. There is a bias absolutely in how those voices are committed, but it is really, really interesting, and absolutely right. It is not just great academic work that gets transmitted into society. There are lots of other things going on there.
And it might link into our kind of final section of this, so just first of all, with what you think are the best possible metrics currently that could be relevant, but secondly, thinking forward, what sort of frameworks would be useful to think about what impact looks like, what sort of kind of guiding principles or ideas, frameworks out there could we potentially focus on?
I mean, I think it's very, very interesting, and it is very field dependent. My own particular field of scientometrics, you have a lot of people who say we don't know what impact is, we refuse to talk about notions of impact, we won't engage with people who claim to know what impact is. If you're working in a business, you know what impact looks like. So, for example, I did a consultancy project with a corporate last year, and they are investing in a particular area of science, but they wanted to know which stakeholder communities accept the science or buy into the science, because what they need to do is to build a science-based market for their products, essentially. They know what impact looks like. They don't have the same philosophical issues that we have in academia, or those of us who are near academia have about defining what impact is. Business knows what it is and it goes for it. None of the qualms that we have. So from that point of view, we have to start with the data that's available. We have to be very critical about what that data is, and to Usha's point, really communicate the value of what it is, and explain how that can be translated and understood and used in a business context, rather than just throwing numbers over the wall, as it were, and hoping that other people will understand that 15,000 Twitter tweets is a good thing.
Mike, actually, and we're moving a bit into questions here as well, though I want to come back to our other panelists on this core question of, frameworks and metrics that we could start to think about. But there is a question here precisely on, your point about it takes 5 to 8 years to have a broader impact in humanities. What they say, the question is from Eva, what data sources are you using to point to that?
So I am coming up on writing a paper which is looking exactly in this, and in this case we're looking at policy documentation. So these are, I mean, very often they're biomedical, but they're not entirely biomedical, because we are looking at, for example, federal government, US federal government documentation about transportation policy, for example. So this is a particular interest of mine, because going back to the beginning of the webinar, we've had 10 years of looking at the engineering of self-driving cars, engineering, computation, and detection. And really, we've had about 18 months to 2 years thinking about how this works on a policy level. And we're only now beginning to see any kind of interest in government areas. So what we're trying to do here is to look for evidence of where academics in this space are having some kind of impact in defining, or at least framing, the conversation that legislators are having in this space of self-driving cars. So I am an advocate of big data, but I am an advocate of being very critical and engaging with that data and actively evaluating it and going after it. Sorry, Andrew, that's not answering your question very well. I don't have a clean answer.
These are not easy questions, let alone the answers. But Usha, coming back to you, any thoughts again on thinking about the frameworks, so kind of conceptualizing impact as a way potentially forward, and therefore to identify metrics that could be useful?
I think that's a loaded question. It has very many layers to it. So let me just start with I don't think there's one framework. I think that there is no one size fits all, and it should in some way correlate with the mission of the college, where it is situated, what its student body and faculty are like, and then build some measures of impact. The second thing is I do think we need a time horizon, but I don't think it's all 5 to 8 years. For example, the National Science Foundation, and I have a grant currently from them as a PI, and I also review for them, has a system where you go out and you have outreach for your research. And that starts well before the actual project is submitted. So for example, I'm already talking about some of the results from my grant, so that it could in some way be of some interest to policymakers. And I think that that process should start right from the beginning, who are you going to be reaching out to? And the media are important, at least in my opinion, they are. And I think we certainly can do a better job of reaching out to the media than what we're doing currently. I mean, as I pointed out to the Academy of Management, I'm not at a really, and this was brought up, oh no, you can't get into the media unless you're at a brand name school, Harvard or Stanford, and unless you've really been there, you're like this, wizened sage somewhere. And I have gotten into the media, I would say on average, maybe once every 2 weeks for maybe a decade or more, and it's the mainstream media. And you have to get a reputation, build contacts, talk to them about your research, and build those relationships and be willing to talk to them in their vocabulary. I don't think that any of this is impossible. I still remember a conversation I had with a young assistant professor who said, I don't see it's my business to go out and meet policy makers or business persons. If they're interested, why don't they knock on my door and ask me what I'm doing? And I just thought the arrogance of that view. It's I don't buy into it. I really think we have a mission, a social mission. We are funded, oftentimes by government funds, to do something with our research and to show its usefulness.
Certainly, as a journalist, I'd agree. I think, very often I find academics don't put themselves forward enough or don't reply to requests when you need a very rapid but expert opinion. So there's definitely more work to be done to support them. And interesting points you made earlier about advocacy as well. But Renate, what's your take thinking about frameworks, about how we might think going forwards of the best way to think about and then measure impact?
I think to think about what it would look like to have impact, and what would it look like? It would kind of mean that on the level maybe of the outcome level, we would enhance the decision-making capacities of the people out there. That would kind of be a way to see that we have impact on them. We would enhance their professional skills. We would change the ways that organizations do their practices, and maybe how their recruitment practices change because of our research. That would be an indicator for that we had impact on them. And then even if you take it further, it would mean that we contribute to achieving societal objectives. And in that way, it would mean that we would have to establish that our research helps to make society more equal in that sense, or less wasteful and so on. And that's why I said that's hard to establish, to sort of show how whatever one piece of research actually made society more equal is probably just impossible. So I think what we should do is, that's what I meant with changing the incentive structures, is opening up for just making it happen, giving it the opportunity, etc. Like me even talking to journalists doesn't mean that if they print in the media, that actually changes the doing in an organization. So it opens the possibility for it, but it doesn't necessarily change it and have impact. But we could kind of say that we incentivize the going out, that we incentivize the opening up, and there we also need help, because I mean I agree with Usha, one can learn that, but still I think that the best researcher is not necessarily the best communicator with the media. So maybe the schools need to do something, the universities need to professionalize that. And some do. And I mean, that's what I meant with there's a lot going on. There needs to be support for the researchers as well to communicate their research to other constituents and audiences. And I think, in my view, we should not expect our top journals to do the trick and sort of be the thing that the practitioners then read, because we need journals to actually establish and validate insights. And I think we also need the journals for the peers to dispute their insights. And there is enough other fora where this kind of communication and translation that Usha was talking about can happen. So I think we can have a lot of incentives, but I still believe that we should not measure how often somebody is mentioned somewhere, because maybe, Usha, you were mentioned in the policy reports or in the legislation that you were part of. But a lot of scholars do have that impact as well, but they are not mentioned at all in the parliaments, because parliamentarians and politicians, as do managers, they want to kind of pretend that it was their own idea.
Maura, let's come back to you.
Can I just say one thing, though?
Very briefly. Go on.
I do think that journals matter, and I've always thought they matter. I mean, I don't think Twitter and LinkedIn can replace journals, but I do think, at least in the United States, we do have to give a greater emphasis on external impact. And as the REF 2021, I think, is the finest example we have currently, where 25% of a school's assessment is based on that external impact. I also think that getting into the media is not necessarily impact, it's outreach. There are varying degrees of impact, but I think it's a first step. It's an acknowledgement. We're changing our language to communicate, and I think that is necessary as well. I also don't think I'm that unique. I mean, my mother thinks I am, but, you know, I mean, I'm not that unique in the sense that I can be the only one who gets into the policy. There are many people who can have their names in policy and federal regulation. I just want to stop right here.
Thanks, Usha. Maura, you wanted to come back in. I see there's some questions here about the SDGs, for example. So going back to this question of frameworks for impact, what's your thought?
I think that this is also an opportunity for us as scholars at this point in time to continually refine the research process. So let me give you an example of what I mean. One of the papers that I worked on recently looked at getting bank branches to move into banking deserts, right? So as we approached that process, one of the things that we did was work closely with the bank and community members to understand the issues before engaging in the research process. And as we worked with them, one of the things that we found is that, you know, some of the insights, this idea of, you know, banks feeling like, you know, those communities are maybe not going to be profitable, or, you know, if they are, we're just going to promote to them as like rich people with less money or whatever, were some insights that, you know, as we uncovered how to approach communities that had a history of not trusting financial institutions, that, you know, those generalizable findings were things that we needed to take into the classroom, push PhD students to think about how they go into the research process differently in terms of this like pre-research engagement and working hand in hand with these stakeholders throughout the process. And then also pushing journals to think differently about contribution. And this is sort of, I think, what both of the other panelists have been discussing, this question of, what is valuable in those pages of the journal, and how do we push beyond just these, sort of incremental contributions, or, sort of like one more moderator on a model that, we've all been studying for a million years, but instead making these big leaps to push scholars to tackle questions that can tie back to those societal goals, like how do we reduce that gap between the rich and the poor? Well, people who are poor need access to lower cost financial instruments, for example. And so I think part of that is just part of our growth as the research community in terms of what we encourage our PhD students to pursue, what we disseminate to our students in the classrooms, and what we do as journal editors to think about what we want to reside in the pages of our journal. And so on the journal space thing, this is something that we're very committed to in our journal. This is like my passion these days. So I think I'm very much in sync with the others, but I think that the framework is about, like, let's move forward in tackling bigger, broader questions in a meaningful way.
So unfortunately we're almost out of time. It's been a great discussion. I see there's a few more. It was a number of interesting other questions here raised. A couple about other slightly wider potential metrics, including use of logs, thinking about identifying ways to kind of encourage or attribute work for doctoral and postdoctoral students. An interesting one here also about teaching and whether there are ways to reflect that in impact. And instead on that, self-interestedly, I'll just post a link, because we did precisely a so-called teaching power index that tried to actually look at works by business school academics that were being cited in other schools' reading lists and syllabuses. So an interesting wider resonance of their research and insights into other people's pedagogies. But anyone like to come back on some of those wider potential metrics that would offer some scope for inclusion in a much broader sense of measurement of impact? Anyone want to go? Usha?
Yeah, as I said, I think you've got to have a cluster of them, because each one of these metrics has an issue with it. We all know the problem with the journal impact factor from Claravit. It's DORA, and we've been talking about it for years, but still universities here in the US and elsewhere use that. We all know that journal rankings are highly subjective, and they don't necessarily measure the best quality of the research that's out there. We use them. There's a convenience issue with metrics, and we need performance measures. I mean, that's cultural, psychological, we need them. So we can't really do away with them. My suggestion is to look at, like Renate said, a range of them, which is, look at journal articles, absolutely, get them in there, get even the journal impact factor, talk about the pluses and minuses, look at media mentions, that's important. It's a form of outreach. Look at effects on regulation, especially if you are cited in regulation, bring it up. That is tangible impact. If you've managed to change something. And even if an organization policymaker says, we used this person's research and he or she was such a great influence, why not use it as a measure of impact? So, I mean, those are all, I don't think that you only really have to wait 5 to 8 years for this. You can have that as some sort of, addendum to your file. And depending on the mission of the university, college, you can use them or not, give them different weights. Currently in the US, to be frank, external impact matters zippo nothing. Okay, it doesn't matter at all. And you might actually be punished for trying to achieve external impact. So I think we're starting from a pretty low base. Anything would be an improvement, any kind of softening of that position.
So Usha, I think unfortunately we really are out of time. I'd just like to briefly summarize some of the other great comments and reflections here from those watching, including the suggestion that perhaps lack of media coverage, amongst other things, reflects a kind of academia talking to itself and focus on theory development rather than addressing external issues. And a quite interesting wicked point here about whether if we're measuring impact, we should also take into account negative impacts, such as the Reinhardt-Rogoff error and how that justified austerity. Interesting point. You might have to subtract as well as add.
It was a really good question, so I've been looking at them.
Yes, I'd certainly encourage everyone who's watched and indeed our panelists to look through some of these comments and questions, and perhaps we can find a way to follow up. There's just one final thing I'd say, and there's an interesting point here about the sort of the danger of certain journals that do get highlighted, including in the FT and elsewhere, because they're seen as prestigious and they're not always the ones that have the greatest direct practical impacts. We heard from some of the publications mentioned here by colleagues. I mean, certainly from my perspective, if there were journals, let alone individual articles, that were able to show more demonstrable impact, those would certainly be things we'd be interested in, rather than creating perverse incentives to be in academically prestigious but non-impactful outlet, shall we say. And the other thing, going back to, I think, is a point that several people have made here, was what's the right level of analysis? And certainly in our view, what we try to do is look at the level of the faculty, the business school, not individual scholars, precisely because ultimately the decision on hiring, firing, promotion, incentives holistically should be one that faculty managements are taking based on data. So some will be perhaps great theoretical researchers, others will be fabulous teachers, others will be much more actively engaged in outreach, and it should be that mix that's both being encouraged and assessed rather than particular individual stars or papers perhaps. But I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you all, our panelists, very much for some great and provocative thoughts. Thank you all for watching. Do watch it back on YouTube and elsewhere, and continue the discussion, and keep an eye amongst others on our efforts to try to promote this debate and identify better metrics as well as more qualitative assessments of impact, which really ought to be, as Usha and others were saying, an essential part of the role of academics and their obligations to society. So thank you all for watching, and stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thanks.